Perfect. All right. Hello to our viewers. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our second live event. My name is Sarah Lords and I oversee communications at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University.
Give everyone just a tick to get settled.
One sec, seems to be passing back. Okay. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to our first conversation in a new series entitled Laid Bare, Vulnerability and Vitalities in the Nexus of Religion, Science, and Technology. This series emerges from one of the Center's projects beyond secularization, New Approaches to Religion, Science, and Technology in Public Life, an interdisciplinary initiative funded by the Templeton Religion Trust. Joining us today is Lauren Gilger, host of the show on KJZZ, our local NPR radio station. Gilger will be moderating today's discussion with Ben Hobart and Arnie Eisen for the talk entitled Laid Bare, Contagion, and Community. But before we begin, I'd like to briefly mention that this is only our second online live event in the time of a quarantine. And so we appreciate you being patient with any technical glitches, very much like the last one we had just a few moments ago. Nevertheless, we at the Center are dedicated to exploring new ways to sharing our work with you, and we very much remain grateful for your continued support in this complex, unprecedented time. For more information on what we're up to, visit the Center website at csrc.asu.edu. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter, and do stay tuned. We've got some really exciting projects that we look forward to sharing with you. With all of that said, now on to the main event. I'm going to hop off for the video portion of this call and return for the Q&A. For those of you watching, you are welcome to submit questions in the chat box just to the right of the broadcast, and we look forward to answering them. And so before I hand this off, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Lauren Gilger. Gilger is an award-winning journalist as well as the host and producer at KJZZ News, the national public radio station here in Phoenix. She hosts a live daily news magazine show covering everything from the biggest local and national news stories of the day to conducting in-depth interviews that add the context to the most pressing issues in our community. Her work on the show has earned national recognition from the Public Radio News Directors Incorporated, specifically for her reporting on infant loss and miscarriage awareness. Lauren, thank you so much for agreeing to be today's host, and I will turn it over to you.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and thank you to our two guests here, Arnie and Ben. I'm going to start off by having each of you sort of introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the perspectives that you bring to today's conversation.
Shall I go first?
Ernie, go
Sure.
ahead.
Good. So I have been a professor of religion with a focus on Judaism for about 30 years, as well as a practicing Jew. And for the last 13 years, I've been the head of an institution in New York called the Jewish Theological Seminary, which trains rabbis and cantors and educators. We offer MAs and PhDs in Jewish studies, and we have an undergraduate program shared with Columbia and Barnard, which are literally a minute or two up the street. You may be hearing in the background right now, New York City's 7 o'clock shout out to the medical personnel and EMTs of New York, which is an effort to do what we're talking about, which is preserve meaning and community in the face of this crisis. So as the head of an institution, I had to do what every head of an institution had to do around the second week of March. We had to make a very quick decision about whether our dorms were going to be emptied out. Given that we were emptying out our dorms and we had to accomplish that efficiently and in a humane fashion within 2 or 3 days, we had to go online. So all of our courses within 4 or 5 days had to move online. We had to preserve the excellence of the operation because we couldn't, as it were, injure the brand or deprive our students and our faculty of a first-rate product. And then we had to make sure that the institution ran well. We had to take care of budgetary problems. We had to deal with all sorts of issues that came up when you have hundreds of employees working from home and you discover that some of your employees don't have computers at home and don't have internet access at home, and yet they have to work from home and they have childcare problems, et cetera, et cetera. So that came up immediately, and we've been dealing in an intensive way with those problems ever since. I'll just say one more thing about the way I approach this. As the head of a religious institution, I'm called upon to do what religious leaders do, which is to offer moral leadership and to offer some measure of hope and comfort and assurance at a time of great suffering and pain. And I've been joining with other religious leaders from a variety of faith communities in doing that over the past couple of weeks. So it's been all COVID all the time, pretty much, for the last 3 months.
Yeah. Ben?
I'm Ben Hurlbut. I'm an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences at ASU. My background is in history of science, and my work focuses on the intersection of science, politics, policy, and ethics, with particular interest in the intersection of science, technology, and religion in public life, or more broadly than religion, the ways of thinking and talking and deliberating about what is essential, meaningful, in the sort of moral and spiritual dimensions of human life, and the ways in which those interface with problems and projects in science and technology. I once upon a time was an eager undergraduate in Arnie Eisen's classes, and in fact, in a sense, got started on the things that I work on, working as a teaching assistant once upon a time for a science and religion class that he taught. And my interest in the issues that we're contending with here are, relate to the ways in which problems of knowledge and sort of imperatives of knowledge, the need to know and know how to respond to uncertainties that scientific expertise is bringing to discussions about how we should comport ourselves as a society, interface with other kinds of problems and questions about the way we should live our lives, the forms of care for ourselves, of governments for their citizens, of communities for their members, etc., are right and appropriate. So there is a sense in which questions of rightness in a scientific sense bump up quite profoundly against questions of rightness in a moral and political sense. And it's the challenges and ambiguities at that interface that are the focus of my research.
As you can tell, they go back a long way. So this is going to be really good stuff. Okay, so let's dig into some of this. I want to start with you, Arnie. So as you say, you lead a religious institution, a religious community. And, the thing that strikes me about this is that religious communities right now cannot do kind of the most basic thing that they do, which is be together to worship, right? I wonder what challenges that has presented, because at the same time, I'm sure this is also, as you say, an incredibly important time for people to use religion, to need it, because of that kind of hope that you can offer that you mentioned. How are you even beginning to strike that balance?
Yeah, and there's a lot of innovation going on, but it's born of pain. So you hit the nail on the head. So people now need each other more than ever before, and they're kind of deprived of one another, and they're deprived of the comfort and strength that people give to one another at moments of pain and crisis like this one. There's a further threat to the notion of community, to the notion of love your neighbor. When I'm in New York City, I'm on the Upper West Side. When I walk down the street, of course, I'm wearing a mask, but I don't want people to come close to me. My neighbors they're subjects of danger to me. They could be presenting a life-threatening problem to me. And so you have the notion of meaning coming from community at a time when meaning, as I call it, meaning with a capital M, is severely challenged, because people are dying at a horrible rate, enormous amount of suffering, enormous pain, affecting everyone directly or indirectly. And how are you going to gather together with other people to find strength in the face of this challenge to meaning? And so many of us have attended Zoom funerals in recent days, and it's very unsatisfactory. It has the advantage that people far away who might not have been able to be there physically can actually take part. But the pain of someone burying a loved one and may not even be able to be there, or other family members cannot be there. Or in Judaism, we have the ritual of Shiva, which is where you go to the person's house and comfort the mourners. Well, hugs are a big part of that. And you can't do that, or reaching out a hand and bringing food to a table. You can't share any of this. So again, there's the advantage that people all around the world can come to a Shiva, but the disadvantage that there's no physical presence offered. And go down the list of all the things that religious communities do. And I can tell you, as someone who's struggled with this, and I had a conversation today with 10 young rabbis, all of whom are struggling with this, meeting for religious services, but in a distance, is just not satisfactory. It does not do what you're trying to do in all sorts of ways. And some people think it's actually a mistake to even try, that it might be better not to do it than to do it in the bad way that we're ending up doing it, because it's so impersonal and so remote. This is a very cold medium that we're all participating in right this second. And at a religious service, you want warmth above anything. And you can't get it this way. So this is the rule of the day. And apparently we're going to go on like this for some time.
I want to ask you a little bit more about that in a moment, but let's turn to Ben first and talk about this idea that I think Arnie's getting at there, which is that there are limitations of what we can do here in this moment as human beings with technology. One of the things that strikes me when you think about limitations right now is just the limitations of what you do, of science. Right here, we're waiting for this vaccine that we cannot get, and this virus, despite all of our technology, all of our advancements, is beating us right now. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's sort of extraordinary, and yet also predictable about the situation that we're in, is that something as simple as this virus can so profoundly transform the world, catch us off guard, as it were. And there have been debates about preparedness or ill preparedness and so forth. And perhaps we could have been more prepared in some dimensions. And yet, I mean, these are the sort of emergent uncertainties that nature throws up at us that simply have to be contended with, and that will take lives and will complicate lives and will disrupt lives and so forth. And for all of our capacities in advances in the biosciences over the last, well, let's say century, there's a sense in which there's a repeat of history here that is quite familiar. Look back over the history of epidemics, over the centuries, and yet the environment in which it's happening is quite transformed in the sense of the extraordinary level of scientific capacity that's available to respond to it. But I think that, one of the kind of straightforward lessons from that is that capacity, though it may be powerful and hopefully will produce an adequate response sooner rather than later, is necessarily insufficient for contending with the sorts of things that human beings and human societies have to contend with in a moment like this. So I actually wanted to turn this back to Arnie and point out that, Judaism is a very old religion. And during that time, there have been many epidemics that Jews and many others have contended with. So contagion, disease, death, these are not new things. In a sense, what's new in our moment is, well, the capacity to engage in, this cold medium, the means for attempting a kind of virtual version of real life. And also, the sorts of technological means that are available to us to hope for a response to gain knowledge of what's happening around us and so forth. Anyway, I wonder if you, Arnie, would say something about sort of what's different and what isn't, and what, looking back to tradition and to the sorts of experience and wisdom that has accumulated over past moments of this sort in Judaism. What are the responses that emerge from that, and how do they speak to the predicaments that you were just pointing to?
Well, this being Judaism, a complex religious tradition with a long history that has spanned many centuries and many different communities around the world, there's no uniformity. That's lesson number one. So just as some people 2,000 years ago responded to crisis by saying, God is doing this, there must be a reason we're being punished with this epidemic, and your only response is to passively bear it or pray to God to take the epidemic away. Even 2,000 years ago, and certainly in the Middle Ages, there are a lot of Jews who would rely on the equivalent of science and say, let's use our knowledge the best we can, and let's try to meet this challenge using whatever technology is available to us, and not assume that we're supposed to be passive in the face of this, or that it proves human incapacity in the face of the deity or something like that. So when I see a rabbi advising his congregation to come to synagogue or to come to the study hall because this is a commandment, and surely God is not going to strike us down with plague when we're fulfilling a commandment, I say, oh my God, we had these arguments 2,000 years ago. I can't believe that someone in 21st century America is denigrating science and medicine like this and putting lives in danger so irresponsibly. So I think one of the lessons is the fact that you've been there before doesn't necessarily give you the wisdom you need. because people don't always learn from history. That's one of our problems. But a lot of these issues are old as humanity, and there have been Jews all along who say, and I just was teaching the great philosopher of Maimonides yesterday, who said the world takes its natural course. People get sick. Some people die. God's not doing this. Right?
So where do you see then, Arnie, the interplay between religion and technology there? Like you're talking about it more of as if it's a partnership, then it's like we either give it up to or give it all to. Yeah,
exactly. That's exactly right. And this is this course that Ben and I were teaching together. How many years ago, Ben, was this? 20 years ago?
Let's not say.
Right. So there are some who think that science has to completely take over religion and wipe it off the map and makes it utterly superfluous. And there are religious thinkers who think that science is all nonsense and heresy, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are people like me, like Ben, who want to see a partnership here and say that the human mind is a glorious gift and let's use it. And science is here to help us make a better world. And this is what we're commanded to do as religious people. So God is a healer. God heals by virtue of the healing that we do. So let's heal, that kind of thing. So it's a marriage of religion and science, the same way we have a marriage of individual and community, of autonomy and responsibility. And instead of putting all on one side or the other, let's find these partnerships.
You want to jump in there, Ben?
Yeah, if you think about the response, the most powerful tool that we've had in responding to this pandemic, it's not actually scientific or technological, though of course, scientific knowledge and expert advice has played a key role in it, but it's community. I mean, when I look back at what we have willingly as a society in America, in the US, but actually globally, what people have willingly given up in the name of protecting each other, because a lot of it was about the spread of contagion, not merely about self-preservation, subjected ourselves to a kind of self-imposed economic disaster, subjected ourselves to profound isolation, giving up many dimensions of our lives that, are essential. It's community that's been the most powerful tool, and the kind of cooperation associated with that sort of community. One of the things that's a challenge, I think, since we responded to this in a moment of emergency, and we responded quickly, rightly so. One of the things that's been a challenge is that there hasn't been an opportunity to ask, well, Maimonides questions, I think. I mean, nature is doing this. Death, people are going to get sick, people are going to die. To ask those questions about what are those dimensions of life that are essential? What are the ways of living together as a community that are appropriate given the fact that nature is going to do this, that people are going to get sick, and that people are going to die? And one worries that the kinds of incapacity that we've imposed upon ourselves to form the sorts of community capable of asking those sorts of questions is itself a challenge that we certainly haven't met, to some degree, I think haven't even quite recognized. That those spaces in which we would gather and we would think and we would talk together and we would make judgments about, what is the right response here. In a sense, we've given those up as part of this communal act of individual isolation. I don't know what we should do about that. My sense is that there are various forms of community that really are important to asking those questions, and religious communities are really high up there on the list. But how to get to that place and what we should aspire to in getting to that place. I mean, I think that's one of the real challenges that we have, as we face a pretty extended period of uncertainty associated with this virus. But maybe this is also in some senses a dress rehearsal for other kinds of crises that we have coming down the pike.
Yeah. Where does that then leave community, specifically religious communities? You mentioned, Arnie, this idea that, we're trying to replicate something online that just cannot be replicated online. What happens to someone's religion when they can't practice it?
It atrophies. And you're already seeing people asking themselves the question, do I really need this? in a sense, the fact that it's so easy now decreases its value. Like all I have to do is flip my switch on and turn on my computer at a certain hour on a Saturday morning, and I've got a synagogue service. But then if I want to flip it off after 10 minutes and do, I can do that really easily too. And it also creates demand that if I can find a better service online that's taking place a continent away than I was receiving from my local religious community, why will I continue to be part of that local religious community? I'll just take this service online, which means you've transformed a religious service into a consumer good that you are consuming. And I'd rather do a higher quality consumer good, and you've lost the community, which we all know is at least of equal value, if not of more value. So your question and Ben's response a moment ago lead me to believe we're not going to put up with this much longer. I understand the pressure to gather together again, and what people who are sensitive to the danger of gathering together are trying to do is figure out, okay, so if we have a space that seats 200 people and we can get 20 people in that space, that's still better than not being able to meet at all. Let's try to find ways of gathering together. You also find a lot of meetings that are taking place outside rather than indoors, and people are improvising all sorts of ways. And for us, for Jews, the problem of high holiday services, the most solemn season of the year, is coming up in September. And there are already rabbis, as I said, I spoke to 10 of them today, who are wrestling with, can we afford to lose the holiday season, which is the season of renewal and repentance and forgiveness and standing before God in judgment? We can't give this up, and we can't do it on Zoom. So what are we going to do about this? And we may be renting tents all over the place just so people can feel each other's physical presence inside a contained space and see each other's eyes, just to see each other's eyes in person. I think we're going to see all sorts of innovation here.
I want to throw that back to both of you, because it seems like there's almost something really beautiful in that, really hopeful in that, right? That we've, through this, realized, one, the limitations of technology and our smartphones, and being on Zoom the way we are right now is just not going to cut it. But then you realize, because of that, like, it matters to look someone in the eye in a way that we maybe were forgetting before this.
You take things for granted, right? Until you don't have them anymore. Yeah, as usual, right?
I hope that's what we're recognizing, because at the same time, we've experienced all sorts of efficiencies. None of us had to go anywhere in order to be here, right? We've experienced all sorts of reduced costs. This is a different kind of ritualized space, but the classroom has been profoundly transformed through this very technology by necessity in a moment of emergency. And yet there's a sense in which, if you think that education is about the delivery of information from the one who's knowledgeable to the ones who aren't, then this is a perfectly adequate medium for that delivery. And there may be all sorts of circumstances in which this is also an appropriate medium, because it's impossible for people to be in the same space because of their schedules, because of where they live, whatever. But nevertheless, if you have that kind of atrophied or attenuated framing of what this is about, the performance of the ritual in the sight of the congregation, the delivery of information from the lecturer to the student audience, you lose a lot. And one does worry that we may forget what it was that we had once we get used to this transformed medium, and think that actually it does all the things that we were doing, just more efficiently and lower cost, and so on and so forth. And I think we're primed to be, there's a sense in which we are embedded in a kind of technological fabric these days that primes us to see things and think things in those terms. In a sense, we're all married to our smartphones in a way that is individualizing the ways in which, in communities, everybody sat at the table with a bunch of people with their phones and noticed when somebody tunes out from the dinner party or whatever because they're checking their email or they're whatever. And there are relatively few moments in which we abandon that sort of individualistic interface with the world and actually collect as a group. And it seems to me religious gatherings are one of those. it's still pretty bad manners to pull out your phone in the middle of a religious service and start texting people, right?
People do it, but yeah. Yeah. Oh, I was
Go
going to say,
ahead.
Ben, we should acknowledge there are so many marriages that are under strain right now. There are so many families
Yeah.
that can't bear up much longer, having to do 2 full-time jobs from home and have to take care of the kids at the same time. The strain is enormous, and some families will not survive the strain. There are friendships that won't start or won't develop because of this. There are people who will die without seeing their loved ones one last time because they can't do that. There's all sorts of inhumanity that's happening, and we feel these one after another as an affront. It's not just, you know, this big affront that you already mentioned, Ben, that this little thing, this virus that's so tiny we can't even imagine how small it is stopping the entire globe. But the fact that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are being killed by it, just like that, and the suffering is so enormous, and human dignity cannot be protected as it could before, and feel that we're in God's image, we human beings, and these human beings in God's image are dying at a rate that is spectacularly, unbelievably, you know, huge. So there's all sorts of threats, I think, you're pointing to our way of thinking of ourselves as human beings, as people who support ourselves. Like 40 million people don't have the dignity of making a living right now, because that's the number of unemployed in the United States. And those people can't support families and the human dignity that comes from supporting a family, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many blows to our dignity that are happening all at once that I don't think that any technology is going to be able to compensate for this, I'm afraid. It can mitigate a tiny bit, but it can compensate. So we have to pray that this vaccine is found really fast and that it works.
Is there something to be said? Do either of you think about the realization that we are not invincible as human beings, that our technology cannot save us, that our science cannot save us, and that, as you're getting at here, suffering is inevitable in a way that we in, you know, recent history just haven't experienced, but in most of history was quite common?
Ben?
I guess I would want to ask, and I think this is sort of the question that needs asking, even as we find ourselves less and less in a position to ask it. The question is, well, what would it mean for it to save us? I mean, we're talking about science and religion, right? So save us in the kind of epidemiological sense is, you know, less deaths, the numbers look better. But of course, you know, religions do saving too, in a sense. I mean, salvation is not just the province of a secular science, it's also the province of a, but you're talking about different sorts of saving. And, you know, that question of human dignity, of the dignified life, which is rightly perpetually a question, which is why one can't simply, you know, read Maimonides and call it a day. He's got the answers. We're done. We need not gather as a religious community. I mean, these are the questions that require community for those questions to be kept alive, because that's where those forms of meaning live. You know, I think that those are questions that rightly live in both the scientific and the religious domains, to kind of caricature those spaces. Since religion should be understood very broadly there, and so too should sort of science, as the sort of a rationalistic enterprise, and the project of enlightenment that seeks to preserve and protect and improve human life and human well-being. The question of what the dignified life is in that domain, what needs saving, what needs preserving, what needs caring for, and what costs to other dimensions of life are acceptable. I think those are sort of fundamental questions that, in a sense, our scientific response needs to be calibrated by the reservoirs of insight and tradition, wisdom that live amongst other places in religion, and of course vice versa, because one can't simply say this is God at work, we hold our service regardless, because absolutely not. Part of the imperative is to understand what's at work and adjust life accordingly.
No, I was thinking,
I
Ben,
think,
go ahead, sorry.
all I was going to say is that is the question. And it's a question that we ought not answer. We can't answer once and for all. We can't answer the question and then set the policy and make the rules, et cetera, et cetera. But the rules, the policies, the practices will be better calibrated to the demands of the day if they are, if they understand that question as spanning those two domains and engage them together in the effort to make sense of what is the right response in the moment.
Right. So I was going to say, Ben, that what you find in your religious tradition by way of meaning always changes with the conditions you're facing. And several weeks ago in the synagogue, we read the portion from the Torah which contains the command to love your neighbor as yourself. And it was an inescapable realization that the category of neighbor is now very different than it was before, because here I am in New York. I cannot survive without people delivering food to my door. And these sirens that I hear all the time are a sign that EMTs are on the job and they're taking people to hospitals where my neighbors are at work and my mail is being delivered by a neighbor, and my subways, which I won't go on right now, are being driven by neighbors who are suffering a really high rate of infection and mortality because they're going to work every day. So the concept of the neighbor has really been altered. And this notion of a global neighborhood used to be merely a slogan, but now we know when the whole world is in lockdown and that we share with people in every part of the world a similar predicament, and that there are scientists working in labs all over the world, and they're sharing information freely, apparently in an unprecedented way, to try to rush toward a cure. So the concept of humanity and the concept of neighbor have really been enriched in the last few weeks. And that's a good, along with the lines of what Lauren was saying, there are things we've actually learned that may be beneficial if we don't forget them.
Okay. So before we go to audience questions, I want to end on this idea that Ben brought up before we went live today, which is this idea of the politics of fear versus the politics of hope, and how we're seeing a lot of the politics of fear being propagated through this, I think for obvious reasons. Ben, first of all, just what did you mean by that? And then we can turn to Arnie.
If the responses are taken in the name of avoiding the bad, and out of fear of the bad, because the bad is an unknown quantity, right? And so any individual Arnie passes on the sidewalk in the Upper West Side is potentially a vector of disease. That's a kind of unknown. But so too, the nature of the disease, how risky actually is that disease, what might, etc. These are unknowns. And there's a sense in which some of our response has been driven by prudence, but some of our response has been driven by fear. And if things move in the direction of fear, in a sense, the preservation of life becomes the ultimate good. And it's not clear to me that the preservation of life as such is the ultimate good, the preservation of life at all costs. Surely the preservation of living, the preservation of certain ways of living, yes, those are absolutely essential. I've been thinking about the concerns that public health officials are expressing about the protests. Look, people are walking shoulder to shoulder, they're not staying 6 feet apart. And on the one hand, one wants to worry, yes, right, we're in the midst of a pandemic. On the other hand, one wants to say, well, is that the priority in this moment? Is what those people should be preoccupied with is distancing themselves from the other people with whom they are gathering to express a kind of a solidarity? There's a tension between fear and hope in that problem, in that predicament. And asking ourselves, what are the ways in which the responses, the defensive responses that we're taking, are oriented by a kind of hope, by a commitment to progress towards, protecting lives in the right sorts of ways and so forth. It's an imperative that those steps be taken, and that kind of progress be achieved. But at the same time, one has to ask, what does that progress look like? I mean, what counts as progressive versus regressive? What counts as oriented towards the collective good versus the sort of atrophying, the attenuation of forms of collectivity which are essential to the good, that, may not recover.
Arnie, I want to throw that
I don't
to
have
you.
any answers, but
That's okay. So do you think, Arnie, that there are lessons in the experiences of religious communities like yours that can push us toward hope as opposed to fear here?
Yeah, I was going to say what Ben put in mind was that the kind of elevator speech that Moses gives at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, when he knows he's going to die as soon as he's finishes speaking, right? That's the situation. And he gives these threefold imperatives: choose life, choose blessing, and choose good. And as Ben is saying, the choice is not really for life, you see, because we don't survive by trying to survive. We survive by standing for something, by believing that we're making the world better than it was before. So we want to choose blessing and we want to choose good. And if people believe there's no hope for improving anything, that if the same injustices that have been going on for too long are just going to continue, then they lose hope and they lose reason to survive. And that actually damages health. So I think the moral of the story is that hope is a necessary element of health, right? And that we as leaders, whether we're religious leaders or moral leaders or political leaders, university leaders, have to be in the business of giving people confidence that the world can actually be better and pointing to the ways in which it has been made better, right? And so, the holiday of Passover happened to coincide with the first big hit of this epidemic. It was in April, the first week of April, and Passover is all about looking back toward the redemption that you've experienced and looking forward to the redemption that you're going to contribute to. And I think that's exactly what religious communities do. They give you the confidence that you can contribute to the work of redemption. I mean, you can see that happening before your eyes. You have hope, and that inspires you to make sacrifices and to live. And we dare not give up on this kind of hope.
You want the last word there, Ben?
Hear, hear.
All right, then I think it's time we can move on to audience questions if we have any. Sarah, you want to jump back on?
Hi, yes. So for viewers, again, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box just to the right. Alternatively, if you would like to email me directly, my email address is sarah, SARAH, .lords, LORDS, @asu.edu. In the meantime, a question from one of our faculty affiliates that shot me over a text. What we were curious about is sort of the idea of contagion and what we can learn from this moment, and more specifically, what the contagion of COVID-19 teaches us about other contagions in society, specifically racism. I think you touched on it a little bit. The protests that are going on now are sort of caught in a moral binding and tension with, public health concerns. So if you guys have any insight that you'd like to offer into that, and we will wait for more audience questions as they arrive.
Arnie, this one's for you.
It's a small question, really.
Well, I mean, I'll say something obvious and simplistic. Epidemics are public health crises. They're always moral crises. And the question of cause and the question of responsibility, in a sense, the question of not just what to fear, but who to fear. One can look at any moment in the history of such crises, and those dimensions are always present, even if they attach to different causes or different people or etc. And I think that, if we think of this as caused by a virus, we are occluding the way in which the world was configured such that the virus, when it took hold, would play out the way that it played out. And so asking the question, not in the mode of fear of the other who might be the vector of contagion, but in the mode of asking, what is the us that prepared the fertile ground for this crisis to play out? That's imperative. It's a lot harder as well. It's easy to mark oneself as pure and locate impurity and contagion elsewhere. But I think that, there is something remarkable about the last, 4 months, in which this kind of moment of collective, almost global compliance with declarations of a kind of top-down declarations of how we should live, led to, as I was saying earlier, this sort of this retreat, even at absolutely extraordinary costs for the individuals who were complying. And then this sudden explosion of dissent, of protest, of a sense of urgency to reflect upon ourselves and rectify the failures of our society. These things are not unlinked. Sociologically, you might say, in the moment, the sorts of feelings, the sort of collective, the state of the collective psyche that's giving rise to the moment that we're in. But much more importantly, in the sense that both of them point to questions about how we organize our societies and the form and the lives that we care for and the lives that we don't, and the ways we go about that, and the priming of our situation for these forms of crises that may in a moment erupt as very visible crises that affect a much wider community, but in many respects are just an exacerbation of things that are playing out on a much smaller scale in normal life. And I think that seeing those, and I think the linkage that the question is pointing to, is totally essential. The numbers speak it to some degree, absolutely. The disproportionate deaths in communities of color and so forth. But that's a surface symptom of much deeper pathologies that, demand a reckoning.
Perfect. Arnie, anything to add on?
Ben said what I was about to say. Let's take another question.
Okay, perfect. So this question comes from Tom. Would the screen 3D holographic zooming help create more emotional connection than what we have now? So essentially, as technology, if we're more advanced in our technology now, would we be able to foster a more significant emotional connection?
I have no experience with this technology, so I can't I have never experienced it. Do you have any wisdom on this? I would think it can't be, it's worth trying. We have to be able to have real discussion. We have to be able to interrupt each other. We have to be able to sense each other's emotional state the way you do in person, but can't do so well on the screen. We have to be able to be surprised by what people say, which is the pleasure of conversation. And we have to be able to somehow connect human intimacy with other forms of relation, like food, like sharing a meal, like other things that you're sharing. And if we can do that better with, holograms, then let's try. But this is not satisfactory, I believe.
So in my view, Zoom, it's been interesting, this experience of transitioning to this medium. On the one hand, it has preserved many things that are important and worth preserving. I was able to continue teaching my classes, spend time with my students. Routinely, they would stay after class for 45 minutes and we would continue talking in a way that actually you couldn't do in a physical classroom because the next class is filing in and so forth. On the other hand, I think that there was a kind of fatigue and collective emerging sense of what was lost. And if you think that the problem is a technological problem, it is in the sense that the medium isn't good enough. But what does good enough mean? That's what, is it achieving a really convincing simulacrum of the thing that's actually real? Is that better? Or is that a kind of terrible fiction that ultimately will deprive us of whatever the difference is between the reality and the simulacrum? It was really interesting watching my 8-year-old daughter experience, first grade on Zoom. It was a novel thing initially. She was sort of into it, but over the course of 8 weeks or so, she became less and less interested. And really, actually, it was a cause of anxiety. And at some point, we just said, okay, you can stop. She wanted to stop. And what's interesting is that almost everybody I know who has a child about that age has had exactly the same experience on the same timeline. What is it that is missing? It wasn't the conversation. It wasn't the sort of face-to-face interaction, because all of that happened. It was being, I don't know, these are my speculations, but it was being in a different social environment in which there were different kinds of adult authorities present with whom she had a relationship that was not mediated by her parents. It was the kind of physical contact, the sort of spontaneous, non-direct, ambient engagement with other people that is remarkably absent from this sort of medium. Yesterday, I took my 11-year-old daughter into a grocery store, and afterwards we were hanging out, and she said, "That was so great going to a grocery store. I haven't gotten to go to a grocery store since March." And you were missing grocery stores? How? I had no idea. And yet it's these features of collective social existence in which one is a person among people that, the medium is lacking in. And you can pick any technology that seeks to replicate or perfect some dimension of human life, and you can tell a story about how that technology was built upon a particular imagination of what human life is, such that technology could replicate or perfect it. And it's a limited imagination, simply because it's somebody's. It was designed in and neglected all of the rich complexity that sort of wasn't seen as central. And so anyway, I think that the hologram, I don't know, maybe it would be great, but we should be cautious about the project of reproducing or improving upon forms of sociality that are essential to being human, because there's a sense in which, to go back to this notion of human dignity Arnie was invoking, they may be generative of indignities that we don't appreciate as such. They may attenuate forms of being human that, will be lost to us if we don't keep them alive.
One way of articulating this or clarifying it is, think about the loss that we're suffering by not having summer camp now. I mean, the institution I direct sponsors a network of educational summer camps around America. And just think of everything that kids are being deprived of this summer in terms of the kind of activities led by role models about 2 years old and there. But we know for a fact that lifetime friendships are formed to a very high degree at these summer camps, and these friendships will not be formed this summer. All sorts of experiences of growing up and development will not happen, or will be delayed, whatever it is. Now you can say, okay, something else will happen, but I don't think so. I don't think that hanging out with their parents at home or taking a family vacation even is going to make up for this loss of experiences with peer groups over the summer. So, and holograms are not going to solve that one either. We just have to get back together again soon. I think we're running on borrowed fuel. In other words, when we see each other on Zoom, as I'm seeing Ben now, I have many years stored up of real life conversations, and I'm filling in the memories of, I'm filling them into what's taking place right now. I think it's going to be much harder to form new relationships this way. And indeed, there are all sorts of dating relationships that are just not happening the same way. Like people are condemned to date only through Zoom and internet right now. And it's a little bit debilitating, let's say.
Yes, confirmed. Here's a question from Charlie. So in both the COVID crisis and in recent uprisings and protests, some have invoked martyrdom or spoken of the dead as martyrs. Others have pointed to problems of how martyrdom narratives, whether it's George Floyd or essential workers, might be misused to justify unjust outcomes or conditions. What alternatives in Jewish thought or in other religious or moral traditions might we embrace instead of martyrdom narratives? Or how might we more ethically reconceptualize this?
So I'll take a stab at that. The notion of martyrdom is overused, I think, in many cases. And we do it because we don't want to believe that death is meaningless. When we lose a loved one, We want to believe that their death is going to lead to good. There's something good is going to come out of it. The fact that this life was taken in this random and cruel, horrible, murderous way, it's just not satisfactory to think that everything this man was can be just snuffed out like that. So we have to believe that it's going to serve a purpose. So there's a concept in Judaism of a person's life being for blessing. And what it does is it puts the responsibility on us who knew the person and want to remember them to make sure that we act as they can no longer act. So we will transform the world in ways that they hope to see achieved. We will take it upon ourselves that we will do this. So it adds responsibility to us. It's not that they're martyrs, it's that they prompt us to a new sense of obligation and responsibility. And that falls primarily on the people who are close to the person who passed away, but really falls on all of us. There was a Jewish thinker you may have heard of that was one of my teachers named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had a phrase that's become, with good reason, very famous. In a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And I like that a lot. So some are guilty, but all are responsible. And that all are responsible speaks to that point I was making about, okay, we are responsible for making sure that this death was not in vain, that something good is going to come out of this death, right?
Beautiful. Ben, do you have anything to add? Take the silence as a note. Okay, so we've got another question from Craig. Can you speak about universities, some of which face similar challenges to faith communities, similar risks of sacrificing in the sense of being together, to various kinds of instrumental performance? And then as a follow-up, how much of this is not new or an exacerbation of old trends learned from learning communities as a model?
Ben?
Well, I can speak to what I think is I'm not sure about the answer to the second question, which I take it as a sort of empirical question. I suppose I could speculate on it. But you know, I do worry that we have developed ways of accounting for the things that we do that have value, that capture some dimensions of value, surface value, like getting an undergraduate education leads to higher, you know, X percentage higher earnings 10 years down the line or whatever. In a sense, you could call that, you know, the epidemiology of pedagogy. That doesn't capture what I think is the real magic that happens in a classroom, which is people are invited together to think critically and deeply about some topic, and they learn to ask questions collectively, and they learn to argue and disagree and dissent and reason together and form consensuses and so forth. I mean, there is a sense in which that's a space of, you might say politics in the micro sense, that is absolutely essential to the sort of moral and civic formation of people. And not just the students, the people teaching them as well. I think that is why I'm in this business. That's the dimension that I find most fulfilling, is being endlessly faced with a new, refreshed and refreshing group of sharp minds to push back and engage in deliberation and dialogue with me. And, you know, we better be careful not to let that slip away, since in a sense that is something that happens spontaneously by virtue of being placed in a room together. Doesn't always happen. It requires certain conditions, but nevertheless, they're much more likely to obtain under those kinds of physical and social circumstances, and will be much, much harder to achieve without those norms as part of the background of, you know, how one interacts in a classroom and so forth. And, you know, easily those things can be driven out if you think that you can achieve those numbers, those metrics that measure value simply by focusing on particular surface dimensions. Those things will be neglected. But I actually think the issue is more fundamental It's not just that they'll be neglected, it's that they're actively occluded by those ways of valuing those forms of community. And I think that, you know, there's a big discussion these days about defunding the police to move into a totally different domain. And there's a lot of debate about what numbers warrant, what demonstrations warrant particular forms of action, particular kinds of response to a sense of a dereliction of responsibility, to you know, a sense that something is wrong with the way we are relating to one another as a community. And it's at our peril that we fetishize those numbers, that we seek the answer to what is right for how to live together in the sort of right answers to those kinds of questions of valuation, where the, you know, objective demonstration according to X, Y, or Z way of counting captures the essence of what is real or not, what is valuable or not. In fact, those questions, those ways of counting, are fundamental questions about community, about what we're here for, what this is all about, and what we should value. And even if it is in some level ineffable, hard to count, capture, quantify, etc., you know, nevertheless, preserving a space for those kinds of vitalities is crucial.
You know, we don't want to come to a point where only small elites get the pleasure of the kind of humanistic liberal arts education that professors like Ben and me love being part of. And I'm here because I benefited from that sort of education when I was a student. And Ben is absolutely right. We can't make this a consumerist thing that the humanities have to prove their worth because employers think that students can write better if they have a liberal arts education. There's something in the formation of human beings and citizens that's lost if we can't have this kind of back and forth discussion among people where they learn to respect people of differing opinions, and they know that they're learning as much from one another as they are from the teacher. And if the teacher is up there lecturing remotely to thousands of students, they're never going to have that knowledge from experience of learning as much from their fellow students as they learn from the teacher. And that's precious. You can't give this up. I would hate to see us lose that.
Well said. We've got one final question and then we'll wrap up before you guys share closing thoughts. This is from Marcia. So, what ways will fear of contagion change our relationships? Will it ever be impolite to talk with someone in public without wearing a mask? Will we use similar levels of fear of infection or assumption that the situation is long lasting? Will those fears become a dominant criteria for friendship?
Well, neither of us is a prophet, so I'll go first and give Ben the last word. But I would say we're not going to put up with this for a very long time, and we've got to believe this is temporary. I don't know what temporary means, but it certainly not more than another year. I'm hoping much less than another year. People are not going to give up on intimacy. We dare not give up on intimacy. And so what might happen is that the risk of intimacy is much higher, and you're going to have to decide on every occasion if that's a risk you want to take. But I'm predicting that we're going to get higher levels of risk. We're going to be willing to take higher levels of risk because we're not going to be willing to sacrifice these close relationships. Then you may disagree since we're in the realm of prophecy.
You know, I mean, if one looks to patterns of the past, it is the case that there's the, you know, circulation in epidemics, that there's the circulation of virus, and then there's how people act, and they may act very differently at time A and time B, even if the virus is still fully in circulation, having the same sorts of biological effects that it has. I think that, I think though that we can ask that question as a sort of predictive sociological question, but I think we also have to ask it as a normative question. Well, what should we do? Because, right, I mean, there is a sense in which, you know, there was something in the Times a few days ago asking epidemiologists questions, and one of the responses was, one of the questions was something like, you know, will we shake hands again, or when will we shake hands again? And the answer was, I never understood that ritual. It seems so stupid. All it is a means for transferring germs from one to another. And indeed, maybe that's what it is, and as such is in a kind of expression of intimacy and sociality, and maybe that's a good transfer of contagion, so to speak. I think these are questions we really do have to ask ourselves, because otherwise we will lapse into relationships that are, in a sense, guided by fear rather than guided by ways of living together that feel right and appropriate, taking into account both the risks of unwitting harm to one another, but also the goods that come from being together in ways that are mutually respectful. So one of these things we need to think and talk about, drawing upon those reservoirs of community that we had coming into this thing.
Well said. All right. Lauren, do you want to lead any closing thoughts?
I just want to say thank you to both of you for all of your thoughts today. Thanks for everyone who's watching. Thanks to Sarah, to the center for making this happen. And I will leave it to our esteemed guests for final thoughts. Whoever wants to go first.
I actually am not without hope in this situation. I think that the steps that people are taking to kind of survive with community and keep themselves transmitting meaning to one another and not just germs is a sign of great hope and resolve, great determination. And there have been so many acts of love and self-sacrifice and altruism, too numerous to count. And that's surprising, and it's always reassuring to see it when you see it. But so many people are stepping up. I've seen this in my local community, but we're seeing it all over the place. And you know, we shouldn't leave this unmentioned. It's a great signal of hope for us.
Okay, Ben.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And I think that there is a moment, and that moment is coming, to step back and recognize these expressions of love and of sacrifice and so forth, and, you know, take these as the elements of promise and hope that should guide us into the future, as we contend with this crisis, whether it disappears quickly or is with us for a longer term, because again, the sorts of circumstance we find ourselves in right now is not so anomalous. It's just scaled up to a level that makes the many difficulties and also promises of ways of living together that much more evident to us collectively. So I want to say thanks to both you, Lauren, and Arnie, for engaging in this conversation, for the audience questions and so forth, because in my view, this is the sort of thing that has felt like it's missing from my life, and is something that we need a lot of in order to get through this thing and to come out of it on a trajectory of progress rather than having to recover from disaster.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up for today. We have a few more of these conversations coming up with different guests, so stay tuned there. But thank you again to everyone. Thanks, Arnie. Thanks, Ben. If you know, it was a live event, I'm sure everyone would be applauding.
Bye, everyone.